Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us on today's IcePick NARUC Brown Bag broadcast. We're going to be talking about the retention of existing nuclear units. This is a pretty hot topic. There's a lot of activity out there in the States, and it's not just the subject of conversation focused on what's actually going on with the power plants themselves, but also a lot of the conversation is steered by issues related to the Clean Power Plan, to the kinds of resources that we're using in different spaces, and also to the availability of nuclear units as we architect out what the future of the grid looks like. Today, we're going to keep folks on mute for the call. I am going to ask y'all to participate, however. The way to do that is to participate using the questions function of the webcast software that's over there on the right-hand side of your screen. What we'll do is we'll have a few folks speak at the beginning, and then when we get to Q&A, I'll be monitoring Q&A, and if there's something that is urgent, I'll interrupt the speakers, and if there's something that can wait, then I'll go ahead and fix that and interrupt the speakers. I am being told that there's a little bit of feedback on the line, so I'll go ahead and try and figure out how we go about fixing that for just a sec. So with that, let me go ahead and introduce what we're doing today. Again, this broadcast is being brought to you by the Eastern Interconnection States Planning Council, which convenes the 38 states in the District of Columbia that are interconnected in the East. The Eastern Interconnection States Planning Council is a project that for another 4 days is funded by the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Thanks, DOE, for your ongoing support of that. You can find out lots about what's going on with IcePick at naruc.org/IcePick. You can also find recordings of the previous webcasts that we've been running this summer on that page. Today we're going to be looking at the question of the retention of existing nuclear units. This webcast is going to be a little bit different than usual. Usually we bring the smartest folks on a topic together to explore a policy topic. We're not able to look at every side of every issue, but we bring together some smart folks to catalyze conversations about this so that we can have good ideas enter into the marketplace of ideas, even if everybody doesn't agree with them. How this one's going to be a little bit different than how we normally run things is we have brought the smartest people on this conversation, on this topic into the conversation, but also I am also going to have a little bit of a speaking role this time, which is a little weird, but hang with me. We'll make this thing work. Today we're going to have Raj Barua from NRRI and I give y'all a preview of a paper that we're going to be putting out this summer that explores what options are available to the retention of existing units. It's also co-authored by Dan Phelan from NRRI. After that, we're going to have Richard Myers from the Nuclear Energy Institute talk a little bit about, if you're on the owner-operator side of this question, how does this look to you? Are we all worrying about the things that the people who are actually building and running these things are worrying about? What are the pressures that they're seeing? What are the questions that they're concerned with? And finally, we'll round third base and head home with Commissioner Ann McCabe from the Illinois Commerce Commission. And Commissioner McCabe is the kind of utility infielder who I can call on whenever I need somebody smart to reflect on almost any policy option. She's been helping us with the 111D work. She's been helping us with a number of other things. And I've asked her to reflect on this from the state commission side of things. Illinois is the state that has the most nuclear units. And so it has the most policy choices that it's got to get right. And so we're really lucky to have Richard and Commissioner McCabe join us today to give us some look at this. With that, I'm going to turn things over for a sec to my paper co-author, Raj Barua. Raj in just a sec. I think I may actually have you on mute for a moment. Raj, are you there?
Yes, thank you.
All right, Raj, I'm going to put myself on mute. Take it away, Raj.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Miles. I want to thank, well, I'll start by thanking DOE for their support on this, for this paper, and especially the several staff members in DOE who have been very instrumental in getting us going on this one. Also want to thank ISPIC leadership, and of course, Miles, always thanks to you. This right off the bat, I should say this. This has been a hard paper for Dan and me to do along with Miles. It's an interesting and it's a tough topic, and hopefully I'll shed some light on why the challenges we faced in coming up with some of these conclusions that we have. To those who don't know about, most of you who are attending probably know mostly about NARUC, but a little bit about NRI because it is really important. NRI was created by NARUC in 1976 as a research arm, but it's an independent corporation, and NARUC's NARUC has a controlling interest on NRI, but NRI is a nonprofit 501c3. And why do I mention that? The reason is NARUC is an advocacy body, NRI is not. So whenever we do our papers and whenever we do our work, we are not allowed to steer anyone in any direction and advise. Our role is to provide the best information and let the commissioners make their decisions. We are primarily funded by the state commissions, and we sometimes do special projects for non-commissioned entities. With that, Miles, you want to switch over to the next slide, please? So why did we write this report? As we know, there's been a lot of nuclear units under construction, but then we started seeing in the news that there have been recent retirements for one reason or the other. The members of ISPIC wanted to explore this issue, and so DOE was kind enough to fund it. And as Miles says, that funding ends in 4 days, but ISPIC does not. I believe ISPIC will continue, and Miles has some ways to do that. The report itself will be out in about 3-4 weeks' time. That's because we're doing some fine-tuning on the report, but the gist of the issues will be laid out today. One of the things I do want to point out is, and this is Miles' sense of humor, and I thought I had a sixth sense of humor. Go ahead, the preview has been approved. Next slide, please. So one of the things we looked at was over the last 50 years, what has been the resource that's used the most for generation of electricity in the U.S. As you can see in the slide, and I always look at these data come from EIA. Excuse me. I always look at a chart or a graph is easier to explain because, as everybody knows, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And in this, to note is that we all know electricity generation from coal is in the 50% region. I don't know how many folks are aware of the growth of the nuclear industry, or at least the generation of the nuclear industry, which in the last 20 years, from 64 it ramped up to about 20% of the generation, and in the last 20 years it has remained steady in the 20% range. This is not the capacity, this is the net electricity generation. Around late 1990s, early 2000, everybody also knows, and just hold that slide there because I don't have a slide after this, but it's something I need to point out. With restructuring happening, everybody knew, or everybody is aware that states that are restructured and have retail choice have actually no control over wholesale generation. When we started looking at these numbers, what we found out was that that half of the generation from nuclear assets is actually from 11 states, which are all retail choice, and they are served by RTOs. To us, that is very significant, and the reason it's significant is that the the state commissions, the states, have no jurisdiction or the authority over the deregulated generation in those states, and the customers are served by electricity that is procured by the load-serving entity in some manner. So to us, it is very important because in a restructured state that has no nuclear generation, the customer may be still served by electricity from a nuclear power plant because the electrons do not discriminate. So those are some fine points that we found, and some of these numbers were very important. Now, if you look at the next slide, which actually has the map, and I want to thank Dan for creating this beautiful slide. He's good with these pictures. And in this, you see the concentration. I think Miles also already mentioned about how Illinois has some of the largest numbers of nuclear power plants, and you can see that most of the nuclear power plants are in retail choice states, which are the blue-colored active restructured states, the blue-colored states. The color has no bearing on political leaning of any state. It just happens to be the choice of color that Dan went with. Then you have in the middle section of the country that there are no nuclear power plants, and so the next slide, please. Next. Okay. So I am going to stop at that because Miles is now going to pick up on the regulatory framework, and then we're going to go back and forth tag teaming, and then again I think we have our other speaker also. So Miles, I'll let you take these. Miles, you there? I think Miles is still on mute.
Okay, thanks, Raj.
There you go.
Smart enough to operate a computer, but not smart enough to operate a mute button. Friends, what we've got here is, as Raj kind of talked a little bit through, the options for states get pretty tricky because there's a stronger than usual federal presence in the jurisdictional frameworks that govern nuclear power, stronger than what you'd see, for example, for gas-fired power plants or for some of the resources that get closer and closer to the customer, as far as ownership and operation and the like. So the feds have some very clear space where they're working research and development, licensing plants for their operations, overseeing operational safety, regulating wholesale markets. Those are a lot of federal responsibilities. And the states persist with their energy facility siting authority almost everywhere, either with other agencies or as a primary responsibility of the commission. In planning, usually this looks like IRP, integrated resource planning, and usually that's a function of something that happens in vertically integrated states, but not always, and there's a lot of gray area. And then finally, in the setting of rates, again, all the states set rates. What goes into a rate case varies, whether you're in a vertically integrated or whether you're unbundled. But in all those states, how the rates are set does have either a fairly direct or a somewhat indirect but still measurable effect on the portfolio mix and the order in which plants are able to be competitive or be dispatched in economic merit order. So siting, planning, and rates, that's the same stuff that we do with everything else. Our paper is going to talk through 4 case studies. And Raj, I don't know if you want to cover at a high level these 4 cases, or if we just want to leave it at we cover 4 case studies. What do you think?
Just to quickly mention that, and again, I've talked about this, where 2 of them were for economic reasons and 2 of them were for operational reasons. So, so if you want to mention that should take care of it.
Okay, terrific. So the San Onofre Power Station in California, the Crystal River Station in Florida, Crystal River 3, both experienced operational problems. San Onofre had some safety-related investments that were much higher than seemed to make sense to the operators and to the context that was out there. Crystal River likewise had some operational improvements and some safety investments that needed making, that in the context of the circumstances that it was in, this is an oversimplification, but there were alternatives to making those investments that served the needs more economically. The other two plants on this list were not confronted by immediate upgrade kinds of questions or crises. Vermont Yankee and Kewaunee in Vermont and Wisconsin, respectively, were both just facing economic hardship. And so the decision to back away from those was not made in the face of an impending large investment. However, those economic issues either caused or moved to the front of the line by operational issues or not, those were really common across those four plants. Anything you want to add, Raj?
No, the only point I want to make is that even in those two, and don't change the slide. The two you did okay in the Vermont Yankee and the Wisconsin plants. One of the hardest things we found was when we started out with the hypothesis, we wanted to see how these closures had affected the neighboring areas, and data was very hard to come by. The reason is they're very isolated samples, just two, and this issue has not happened too many times, so therefore you cannot draw conclusions very easily. But it's most of the in our paper you'll see most of the issues that we've laid out are I would call anecdotal. Those may happen somewhere else, may not happen elsewhere, but things like local economy, how it was affected, things like the population and how it affected the state. Because a lot of these plans do end up being a substantial tax base, not just the utility side of it, but the general economic conditions of the region. So data was hard to come by, and comparison was very hard to do. So in our paper, mostly you'll find that it's anecdotal in nature. Go ahead, next.
So I also brought in a couple of the uprate cancellations that came through, just because I was trying to ask myself, are the economic pressures on these 4 units, which is not a huge sample size within the whole context of the nuclear powered power fleet, and certainly it's a drop in the bucket compared to the overall national portfolio of power plants. Are other ways by which the nuclear fleet is encountering challenges also based in economics, or is it based more in perceptions that the waste problem is unmanageable, or the perceptions that there are other kinds of circumstances? So we pulled out a couple other cases, these 2 uprate cancellations, one in Pennsylvania, one in Illinois. And going into this, the uprates were applied for, and then subsequent to the economic evaluation of whether that made sense or not, after the company had gotten pretty far down the line of trying to figure this stuff out, the economic environment it was operating in had changed, and so the company decided to back out of this and paid a decent-sized penalty for the cancellation of those 2 uprates, which would have added about 1,600 megawatts in total to the system. So that made me ask, what are the pressures that are really making this difficult? And it seemed that the uprate cancellations in the 4 canceled plants applied the following logic to me. So going into this, y'all should know that I don't know exactly where I stand on the right where I have a personal opinion about everything. But on this, I'm still figuring out what my personal opinion is about what's going on here. And like y'all, I'm just engaging in the marketplace of ideas. What these case studies seem to indicate to me was that a lot of the economic pressures that were on these plants were influenced by the economic alternatives that are available in the near term. Specifically, the wholesale price of power is pretty low, and that in a lot of places is a function of the low price of gas. The operational and policy issues that confronted these plants compounded those economic pressures, but it really was economic pressures, and particularly economic pressures in a fairly near-term price knowledge environment that put a lot of pressure on these. The policy context that I'm talking about is when you're facing a question about keeping a plant going or not keeping a plant going, there's a very subtle and hard to measure factor, which is this going to be too hard? And there is a pressure point that has entirely to do with policy, at which a company may say, look, we could go through this policy hurdle of getting, in this case, the one pressure point that I did find was the hoops of relicensing. Is this a place where positive or negative intervention is going to make this really, really difficult or really, really easy? And so we did identify that there are 18 plants in relicense right now and 6 more that are in the mail in the next 10 years. So if you're looking at places where policy pressure is being applied in addition to potential operation and economic pressures, those are the places you might want to look. I will note, Raj pointed out really well how in vertically integrated states, there are a different set of policy levers that can be pulled than in states that have unbundled. But for both cases, the options for intervention can be kind of limited. I also love this map, which I'm showing again. Thanks, Dan, for this amazing thing. The reason I'm showing this map this time is to show that for those of y'all who are in the Eastern Interconnection, this isn't wholly an Eastern Interconnection problem, but it's mostly an Eastern Interconnection problem. If you want to navigate the future very effectively, most of the plants that we have out there, the existing fleet, is in the Eastern Interconnection, and so it's us who has to be mindful of that.
And Miles, if I may make a quick point on your next slide, in our study we found out, and Miles, you point out very well where states are looking at different options, and I'm sure Commissioner McCabe of Illinois will at some point mention this, but I just want to lay out the scenario that in May of 2014, the Illinois House of Representatives adopted a resolution that requested the 4 state agencies in Illinois, Commerce Commission, Power Agency, Environmental Protection Agency, and the Department of Commerce, to prepare reports that would address, and I quote, issues related to the premature closure of nuclear power plants, end quote. Now, in that exercise, which I thought was very good, or I shouldn't even say exercise, in that proceeding, the responses from various stakeholders were very important, and notably I want to point out the 2 RTOs that serve separate parts of Illinois, PJM and MISO. They both reported that the cost of wholesale electricity would increase. In both cases, that these nuclear plants were critically important to maintain a safe and reliable transmission system. Again, I'm quoting some of these. But what I found interesting was that in both cases, and it was to us, some of us, I think it was obvious that yes, if you shut down some plants, then power the cost of power will increase. But to hear from the experts who ran quick models, it kind of reiterated that closure of these plants would end up resulting in increased wholesale power costs, which would result in increased retail distribution costs as well. So, Miles, go ahead.
All right. So there is a philosophical question about what kind of power system we're moving towards, which we're not going to get into during this presentation, that has to do with, do we want to keep backing large baseload style? Are we moving towards more distributed style, et cetera? And that's a great conversation, and I look forward to having it another time. It's just too much to unpack in this conversation. For this conversation, what I'm going to focus our ideas on is, if you're interested in preserving these units, if you want to preserve some of the dispatchability and low carbon and price spike resistance and the durability of these plants, et cetera, and your choices are somewhat limited, what are some creative ways that you can go about picking this up? The options are not just limited in restructured states. They're more obviously limited in restructured states, but there isn't a commission in the country that can order the continued operation of an uneconomical and certainly not an unsafe nuclear power unit. So how do we anticipate those problems, and how do we, if we're interested in preserving those units, go about addressing them? The set of recommendations that we've been putting in this paper that are ideas for exploration address the underlying factors. And the way that we've done this is Dan and Raj did a great job of identifying some of the work that's been done in some of the state legislatures as well as some of the state commissions. So these ideas mostly draw from some practices that have been picked up in different states. To use supplemental funds, a lot of states have public benefit funds or emergency funds or other kinds of funds, and to use those other funds to support some of the expenses like decommissioning or the like. Addressing specific decommissioning funding outside of the context of including it in the dispatch price of power buried in there somewhere. Using tax incentives or exemptions that facilitate, that take some of the bumps out of some of the things that may need to be done for operational or safety investments and improvements. Providing an ROE kicker for safety investments or for other kinds of management of the plant investments. I've included carbon pricing in the list. The fact is, as a baseload energy resource, hydro and nuclear tend to show up with low or no carbon footprints, and fossil-fueled power plants do tend to show up with some sort of carbon footprint. So if you start pricing that, that will give an advantage to those plants that don't have CO2 emissions or carbon emissions. Highlighting nuclear energy and resource planning and state energy planning. For those states that don't use IRP, a lot of states still use state energy planning. And so that's another tool that can help focus attention on creating transparency and opportunities to keep those units on. And then orders and legislation signaling support. Mississippi and South Carolina have both passed these. Other choices, this one is a little bit out there, but as we have capacity markets and products, at least in the marketplace of ideas for exploration, would be a dispatchable capacity product that doesn't just pay you for existing, but also that covers your callability. Creating a clean energy standard, the way that RPS standards have been created to encourage renewable energy, a clean energy standard would encourage different types of generation that have a defined emissions characteristics. Another would be to create a state team to explore policy obstacles and potential opportunities for support. Basically, a team to recon out the things that are coming that will challenge those plants and to identify how to make policies that don't make it worse or even make it easier. And this is an approach that's been used in other policy arenas. Passing legislation that removes bans or moratoria on nuclear energy. There are a few states that still have those. And in those states, if you want to lower the obstacles to preserving your existing units, I'm not sure the extent to which that helps, but it certainly does send a message. And then finally, engagement by the states to reserve long-term waste issues. I think most states are pretty engaged in this that have nuclear power plants, but certainly staying on that is an important piece of the challenge that confronts those nuclear units. So this slide may be wrong. Raj and I have a couple little pieces of agreement to reach in the finalization of this paper, but that's what happens when you put together a supergroup with the world's best guitarist and the world's best singer. And I won't tell you which one is Raj.
Which one is it?
We'll try and wrap this up. It'll be posted up on these websites. Raj, any final contributions?
Yeah, just one point I want to make, which the list that you provided in the previous slide. Again, don't move that. Don't worry, it's not in there. But one of the things we found is, everybody talks about wholesale deregulation and et cetera, but the principles of rate making still exist, which is known and measurable and used and useful. But we found out in some instances, the used and useful principle might have to be superseded because I'm not suggesting it, but there could be recovery of all prudent costs, so that's known and measurable, for pre-construction study, analysis, preliminary engineering, and feasibility studies, even though in the end a nuclear power plant may not be built. Now that's talking about new nuclear. So there are a lot of things that the point I'm trying to make here is that in the last slide that Miles laid out all those issues, I think what is important is that the state decision makers, now this is not just the regulators, this is even the legislators, the state decision makers may have to think outside the box to see what's best for their customers and their citizens. That's it, Miles.
All right. So, friends, as I'd said before, I am still figuring out for myself where the path leads on this for me. And so these ideas are not things that I'm going out and saying these are the greatest ideas. They're within the space of what you do if you were exploring that. However, the next guy who is going to be presenting to us, Richard Myers from the Nuclear Energy Institute, whose slides I am pulling up right now, is definitely a person who has an interest in seeing this work and work well. And so I am going to put his slides up, and we'll see if we can't... Sorry about this, friends. I'm almost smart enough to operate this thing. Richard, are you there?
I am, yes.
Richard, let me go ahead and pass things over to you. Friends, you're going to see a little bit of funny stuff on the screen while I try and get this looking exactly right. But Richard, if you want to go ahead and get started.
Miles, yeah, sorry. I was going to suggest to Miles, make it 100% your screen view. It shows 118%. That may.
Let me just see if I can do a full screen. Anyways, Richard, do carry on, and we'll get this rocking and rolling for you in just a sec.
Okay, thanks, Miles, and thank you, Raj and NARUC, for giving us this opportunity. As Miles said, this issue of nuclear plants at risk is we regard it as a major strategic issue, and we're very encouraged that NRRI and NARUC have taken it on in such a constructive way. Let's go. I'll breeze through this pretty quickly so we leave some time for the Commissioner and for questions, but just to get everybody kind of situated, if you don't live with nuclear power day in and day out, the industry has been running at a very high level of safety and reliability consistently on a sustained basis for the last 15 or 20 years. And you can see the numbers there on the right-hand side. Capacity factors typically in the 90% range, generating about 800 billion kilowatt hours a year out of 4 trillion or so. And particularly important as we're grappling with the Clean Power Plan and 111D, when you look at the breakdown of carbon-free electricity in the United States, nuclear is about almost 2/3 of that. So a very significant contributor, not only to U.S. electricity supply, but to carbon-free generation. Next slide, Miles. Miles talked a bit about license renewal and new construction. Just to give you a little more texture, our plants are licensed initially for a 40-year period. This is a well-established regulatory process for license renewal that allows you to operate from 40 years to 60 years. There are 99 reactors in the country, as you can see. About 3/4 of them have already been through the process and had their license renewal approved. There are 18 under review and 6 that intend to review. This whole program rests on a very systematic and comprehensive program to manage the effects of aging on equipment, on systems, on structures, and is really quite predictable and very well established. We're now, in fact, working with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission on what it would take to go to a second license renewal period and run the plants past 60 years towards 80 years. We expect that a number of them will, not all. It will depend on business conditions in the markets in which they're operating, because license renewal, whether it's the first license renewal or the second license renewal, does and will require capital investment. But we're working with NRC on the regulatory process. We're working with the Department of Energy and EPRI. Both are funding programs to look at technical feasibility. And so far, at least, we've identified no showstoppers. Bear in mind that we try not to let these plants go old. We invest a lot of capital in them to make sure they're always up to date. Miles mentioned new construction. We're about halfway through a $30 billion plus construction program, 2 reactors in Georgia, 2 in South Carolina, one in Tennessee. Tennessee Watts Bar 2 will be the next one in commercial operation. These are big projects, big plants. Just one of the new reactors in Georgia or South Carolina will make about 9 billion kilowatt hours a year, which, just for perspective, is roughly what we produced from solar energy in the United States, in the entire country, in 2013. We've been doing a lot of work over the last several years, as you can imagine, incorporating the lessons learned from Fukushima, and we really have identified ways to increase the safety and our ability to handle extreme natural events, whether it's earthquakes or floods or other things. And as I said, we try not to let these plants go old. The industry invests substantial sums of money on an ongoing basis to maintain reliability and safety. In 2013, about $6.5 billion across the industry in capital improvements. Some of that to replace equipment, some of it to do power uprates. Miles mentioned power uprates being canceled at LaSalle and Limerick, which is certainly true because the markets don't support them. But we do have some pretty substantial uprates going forward. Florida Power and Light just completed 2 big power uprates at their plants in Florida, added about another 525 megawatts. And in fact, Exelon and PSEG are in the middle of a big power uprate at their Peach Bottom facility in Pennsylvania, which is about a $700+ million project. So some of these uprates are still definitely moving forward where they make good economic sense. Next slide, please. So Miles also touched on this, and I'll breeze through this pretty quickly, but I think all of us have a tendency to think of electricity as an undifferentiated bulk commodity, and it really is not. Every kilowatt hour out there on the grid has a kind of a unique signature, a unique pedigree, a unique set of attributes associated with it, depending on how it was produced. And some of those attributes have value to the grid, and they need to be priced, and generators need to be compensated for providing those attributes, or they may stop providing them, and that's what we're beginning to see. So this slide gives you just a visual representation of some of the key attributes of nuclear power. And I won't go through it. You can read them at your leisure, but forward price stability is obviously important. Carbon abatement value is important. Voltage support, grid support is important. Very high availability. You'll know they'll run when they're called upon. Also extremely important. And of course, there are other attributes too. Next slide, Miles. So 2 events last year really focused attention on the value proposition for nuclear power. One of them was the polar vortex, which was really not one event, but a series of actually 5 major cold spells that occurred across the country between January and March. But the polar vortex, particularly in the east, really demonstrated the value of baseload capacity with firm fuel supply. You all know the numbers. PJM, which is what, 190,000 megawatt system, found itself a couple of days in January 2014 with 22% of its capacity forced out of service. That's 40,000 megawatts. For all sorts of reasons, but 10,000 megawatts of that was gas-fired capacity that couldn't get gas at any price. So having an asset like a nuclear plant, which has 12 to 24 months of fuel sitting in the reactor vessel, really was highlighted in that situation. The other event last year that focused attention on the value of nuclear was EPA's Clean Power Plan, the 111D proposal, and it was abundantly clear, I think, to most people that it would be difficult, if not impossible, to reduce CO2 emissions by 30% by 2030 without retaining the existing nuclear capacity and building new nuclear capacity. And you can see the tons avoided by the various carbon-free sources at the top right, as you would expect, given that it's 63% of the carbon-free generation. Nuclear avoids more tons than any other carbon-free source. And kudos to NARUC for having recognized this in a resolution that passed at the annual meeting last November in San Francisco. And just a quick snippet from that in the lower right corner. Next slide, Miles. So let's look at these plant shutdowns and kind of peel them apart just a little bit. We had 4 reactors shut down in 2013, 1 at the end of last year. The Crystal River 3, San Onofre 2 and 3, we really regard as unique events. I would take issue with the assertion that there were safety problems. There were no safety problems. These were steam generator replacements that went badly for different reasons in both cases, but the story did not end well. But we do think they're unique. We've replaced steam generators in about 110 pressurized water reactors around the world, 57 of them in the United States, and it's a pretty routine undertaking. These are 2 situations that were not routine and did not turn out well. We don't expect to see those repeated. The Kewaunee plant in Wisconsin, the Vermont Yankee plant in obviously Vermont, shut down because of market conditions, economic stress. And to us, that is much, much more serious. They're like the canaries in the coal mine, particularly because they were very, very high-performing plants. Both of them were posting 90% plus capacity factors. In fact, when Vermont Yankee shut down at the end of last year, it had just completed something like a 434-day uninterrupted continuous run. So these are valuable assets from the point of view of the electricity consumer and the grid that could not continue to operate because of the markets were not recognizing and valuing them appropriately. And then we have other plants at risk. Exelon has made no bones about the fact that 5 of its reactors in Illinois, Quad Cities 1 and 2, Byron 1 and 2, and Clinton, are experiencing pretty severe economic stress. The Davis-Besse plant in Ohio, First Energy has made it pretty clear that that too is under stress. The Ginna plant in upstate New York, another Exelon facility, also under stress. So this situation concerns us, and we think we're certainly doing everything we can as an industry to address it, and are encouraged somewhat by the reaction both from the FERC and state governments. Clearly recognizes a problem here, I think. As Miles said, more difficult to figure out quite what to do about it. So next slide, Miles, if you would. So why are we losing these plants? You know, it really is a combination of many, many factors. some of them you could ride out if it was just one of them, but when you get 3 or 4 or 5 of them all landing in the same place at the same time, it makes life truly difficult. Just a couple of the key points: low growth in electricity demand coming out of the '08 recession. There are still some parts of the country that have not gotten back yet to 2007 levels of electricity demand. Some of that is economic conditions, some of it is structural, but nonetheless it is certainly depressed markets and power prices. The continuing surge in supply of low-cost gas, particularly a problem in PJM, in New York, in New England, which is sitting on top of the Marcellus and Utica shales. A lot of production coming out of those two plays, and still waiting for the pipeline capacity to catch up with the supply to take it out to market. Until that happens, Marcellus and Utica gas are trading at a pretty substantial discount to the Henry Hub. Transmission constraints, particularly some of the Illinois plants, are disadvantaged by congestion on the grid and the need to pay a penalty to get the power out. We have some issues with price formation in the energy markets, with capacity markets. We see a number of ways in which the RTOs take actions, take steps in various ways, and certain costs associated with running the grid do not show up in the locational marginal prices. So that price suppression in energy markets, the need for reform in the capacity markets, all of that is an issue. And then I think because we inherited a very robust and resilient system, that fuel and technology diversity does have a value, but it tends to be taken for granted and thus undervalued. So those are some of the factors that are playing on the nuclear plants, and in some cases on the gas-fired generation too. And it's our view that if we don't come to terms with them, and kudos to NARUC for having begun to grapple with this issue, but if we don't come to terms with them, we could very well compromise reliability and expose consumers to higher prices, and certainly in the case of losing nuclear plants, significantly frustrate efforts to reduce carbon emissions. Next slide, Miles.
Richard, I'm looking and you have 4 slides left, and I really want to get to 2 further down from here, that what can states do. I wonder if you can, would you be?
Yeah, let's flip through. This one just shows, and you can look at this, folks can look at this at their leisure later. The next one is an important point. Alex, go one more, Miles.
Yeah.
Yeah. Look at the bottom. Let's work from the bottom up. The bottom up shows you the costs, total generating costs for the existing nuclear plants for a single unit like a Kewanee or a Vermont Yankee, average across the fleet, and then for the multi-unit sites like, for example, Quad Cities or Byron or many of the others that make a lot of kilowatt hours. You lose one of these units, at some point you're going to have to replace that capacity. You're most likely going to replace it with combined cycle gas, and you can, those of you on the webinar can look at the numbers, but even shutting down a relatively high cost $50 a megawatt hour single unit nuclear plant, you're going to replace that $50 a megawatt hour with $70 electricity from a gas plant, and that just doesn't seem to make any economic sense to us and looks like a bad deal for consumers. Moving on, Miles, some of this you caught in your slides, but it lists some things that states could think about doing, offering Illinois as an example. I think everybody knows that the Illinois legislature considered and continues to consider a low carbon portfolio standard. But there are other things that states might consider doing. I would just highlight the second one, having states encourage both FERC and the RTOs to generate some sense of urgency about addressing defects in market practices and rules could be hugely important and very useful. You know, even though the states have transferred responsibility for resource planning and resource adequacy to the RTOs and FERC, it doesn't mean that states don't have a pretty keen interest in resource planning and the shape of the generation portfolio. So I think states may want to think about reasserting themselves in this space. And then finally, the last slide. We do believe that fuel and technology diversity has value. We're concerned that we're losing it as a country. We're certainly losing roughly a third of our coal-fired capacity in a fairly short period of time. We're now beginning to lose some nuclear, loading more and more dependence on gas-fired generation. We asked, along with Edison Electric Institute and the Chamber of Commerce, asked IHS Energy to do some analysis for us on the value of diversity. You can find this on the NEI website, and you can see some of the costs associated with losing the diversity we enjoy today, which we largely inherited, and we've kind of worked our way through it, and we now have to take affirmative steps to maintain it and keep it going forward. So let me stop there, Miles, and turn it back to you.
Thanks, Richard. The third and final speaker is going to be Ann McCabe, Commissioner from Illinois, which has obviously been someone, an organization that's been very involved in this stuff. Let me just see. Commissioner McCabe, can we hear you?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we sure can. Before I turn things over to Commissioner McCabe, I'm going to do something I've never done, which is to extend our webinar by about 5 or 8 minutes. I've never done this before. Commissioner McCabe, I hope you recognize how awesome I think you are. We're going to add about 5 or 6 minutes on the end of things here so that you definitely have a chance to say what you're going to say, and we have an opportunity to discuss. Commissioner McCabe.
Thank you. I think time for questions is important. And when Miles kicked off the call, he said Illinois has the most nuclear plants and the most policy choices, and I think I beg to differ. I think any of the 31 states with nuclear plants face a lot of the same challenges and choices. In Illinois, nuclear competes with both wind and gas-fired plants. Nuclear power has been affected by a decline in electric prices caused by a surge of renewables and a decrease in the price of natural gas. Illinois has the most nuclear plants in the U.S., as it has been mentioned, and 3 plants, Byron, Clinton, and Quad Cities, are at risk, mainly due to the price impacts of wind and natural gas, as well as not clearing in some of the last PJM auctions. So almost 50% of the state's electricity comes from nuclear. That is a huge assist and asset in reducing greenhouse gases and other emissions, and will be an asset in meeting 111D regulations. The draft NARUC paper captures a lot of the issues and tensions and the reasons nuclear plants are at risk: economics, safety, operational, policy, and possibly relicensing hurdles. In addition, the paper asks questions about nuclear power's long-term benefits in the face of near-term closure risks. And I think the previous speakers have all addressed a lot of those benefits, including reliable, dispatchable baseload in all kinds of weather, low emissions, and there's also local benefits in terms of jobs and taxes. And talks about how these non-remunerated benefits can be better recognized. So yeah, Illinois has 11 nuclear units at 6 sites. They're licensed to operate from 7 to 18 years and can be relicensed. Exelon owns all the nuclear facilities in Illinois. As Richard said, these units operate at very high capacity factors, and in Illinois, being a restructured state, a lot of that was driven in part by the state's 1997 restructuring, which set up a competitive market. The state's nuclear plants plus restructuring and retail competition are the reason Illinois has some of the lowest electricity rates and produces a lot of zero carbon electricity. While the fleet runs well, Exelon has said a number of the units are economically challenged. They've experienced losses and face ongoing capital costs and economic risks of operating these plants. The Illinois Commerce Commission has little ability to determine the mix of generation or fuel diversity. The energy markets are complex. We're in 2 RTOs. Some would say the changes in PJM's capacity performance and the Clean Power Plan may help the nuclear plants in the longer term. Others would say those are not sufficient to prevent the at-risk plants, given the kind of near and long-term challenges. As several speakers alluded to, given some of the at-risk plants in Illinois, the State House passed a resolution requiring 4 state agencies, including the Commerce Commission, to look at what the impacts of losing 1 to 3 plants would be. And they looked at electric rates, transmission, reliability, environmental and economic impacts. They looked at market-based solutions, how the nuclear generation would be replaced, and other impacts. PJM, MISO, the PJM Market Monitor, and universities did modeling and analysis. And we can provide a link to that report if folks are interested. The impacts of the closures showed a potential cost to Illinois of $1.8 billion in annual economic activity, almost 8,000 jobs, and increased energy costs by as much as 16%. Illinois EPA also cited societal costs of increased air pollution. The report suggested a handful of possible solutions, ranging from relying purely on the market, establishing a cap and trade program, imposing a carbon tax, or adopting a low carbon portfolio standard. And that last recommendation became the subject of pending legislation to create an LCPS that would require 70% of electricity to come from low carbon sources of generation. And the Illinois Power Agency would conduct a competitive procurement for low carbon energy credits each year, just as it does for renewable resources. I'll add that critics of the legislation are concerned the rules are too narrowly drawn, and the primary winner could be Exelon's own nuclear fleet. So with that, I particularly like Miles went through over 10 measures or suggestions to help retain the nuclear plants, and I think those give us a lot of good discussion material. So I'm going to turn it back for Q&A.
Commissioner McCabe, you're the best. For those of y'all who don't know well enough how much we should appreciate Commissioner McCabe, she's participating not from her home or office. She's actually freewheeling it out there and is in kind of a tough spot to do this participation. So super appreciate your being able to hang tough and no weird meowing cats in the background, which is something we've had on a couple of these webcasts. We've gotten a bunch of great questions, and I'm going to start with one that focuses, Richard, this one's probably for you, but it's probably just one for us all to consider as well. There's an element of the rhetorical to this. One of the states that you'd noted has a plant that is climbing over some obstacles and trying to figure out whether it's at risk or not, as in New York. New York is also the oft trotted out example of a state that's really asking questions about the makeup of the power grid and of the fleet that serves it, and our customers, customer-owned generation, transactive energy, storage, large participation by demand response, et cetera, the backbone of how we make and move and use power, or is a paradigm that's more focused on baseload generation and dispatchability and those kinds of questions more the backbone? So let me ask this. Is New York a place which exhibits a set of questions about whether we're facing a paradigm change in the system, if you're the nuclear folks, and if New York is a place that's at least asking the questions about if there's a paradigm change afoot, is a paradigm change really any kind of obstacle or threat to nuke units? It feels like nuclear units are a big deal, and is this really a challenge to them?
I think what's a challenge to all of us is folks out there that persist in the belief that it's one or the other. I think clearly distributed generation is here to stay. I think the cost and performance trends for solar and wind over the last 10 years have been truly remarkable and should be celebrated. I think that but that any reasonable understanding of the way the electric system works and any rational analysis I've seen suggests that you need both central station base load and distributed to run a resilient, reliable grid. The distributed needs the grid to for balancing purposes and other things. I find it hard to believe that you're going to run a 4 trillion kilowatt hour a year economy entirely on distributed generation. So I think the answer is that, as I said, diversity of fuels, diversity of technologies, small, large, they all have a legitimate role to play, and we need to recognize that.
That's a great answer. I got a great question from Gary Garrett from the Southern States Energy Board, who's whip smart and always has the questions to prove it. But I think, Gary, that this question may be best steered towards the transmission operator community or the like. So I'm going to pose it. If folks say, how about that? Yes, that is something we'll need to consider. I'm cool with that. He wants to know whether in the face of the Clean Power Plan, does enhanced wheeling within regions increase the value of nuclear as a potential regional solution to the Clean Power Plan? Again, I think this one may be transmission focused enough that Raj and Richard and Commissioner McCabe and I may go like, yeah, that's a good question. Let's include it in our ongoing exploration. Would y'all agree? Let me note, we also had a really good question that is sort of framed in reverse. Scott Brown from Exelon's been giving me a lot of ideas and insights from the perspective of a company that's operating a lot of this. And he had a difference of opinion about the dispatchable resources, the dispatchability basis for compensating plants. Richard, I am going to throw this one at you, and Scott, you'll forgive me, I think, for questionizing your comment, which is the participation of dispatchable or non-dispatchable units as a kind of a provider of our power a distraction, and is the real problem that some units get subsidies, some kinds of power get subsidies and others don't, and those aren't reflected in energy prices? Or is the dispatchability really at the core of this thing?
Gosh, I don't know how to answer that question.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, no, I mean, clearly to the extent that some resources are subsidized and some aren't, that creates discontinuities in the market. Yeah, but that's a much larger political issue that I'm not quite sure how I wrap my head around. I think clearly dispatchable resources have a certain value that non-dispatchable resources do not, simply because they're dispatchable. I think one of the to me truly distressing things is to see low carbon wind cannibalizing low carbon nuclear at a time when we're trying to expand the generation of low carbon electricity. It just seems like public policy is at odds with itself.
Commissioner McCabe, I'm going to throw this last one to you. I know that Richard has an interest in this one as well, but Commissioner McCabe, with the limited time, let's throw this at you. Ken Costello asked, he notes outside the South, nuclear energy generally has a poor image, even though it has some positive features. So is there something we should be doing to communicate the positive attributes along with the costs and other kinds of questions with the general public?
Well, I would say, given the debate and the discussion over the plants at risk in Illinois, there has been lots of media focus on the benefits nuclear brings all over the state of Illinois, at least in the last year. So hopefully that's raised awareness, and but I don't know. I'm sure the average Chicagoan doesn't realize how much of their electricity comes from nuclear.
Well, that is an excellent way, I think, to conclude. Friends, I'm going to go ahead and let us all go home now. Thanks for letting us run a little bit late today. I know that's unusual. We ran a little bit long. Raj and I are going to finish dusting off whatever's left to adjudicate within that paper, and I'm pretty set on us putting it out sometime before too much of the summer gets by. Do keep your eyes open for it. We'll be putting it out. I think this is a good start to the conversation. I think I look forward to hearing the discussion at the NARUC summer meetings and thereafter. Friends, I hope you'll join me in thanking Richard Myers, Raj Barua, Commissioner Ann McCabe for speaking on today's webcast. I think it was a good one. Next week, we are taking a break from our brown bag broadcasting. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a whole set of programs that I'm sure y'all will enjoy. Thanks again. Talk to you soon.
Thank you.